I'm Jenny Brocky. Tonight on Insight, what makes a psychopath?
Now, I've studied over the past 18 years the brains of serial killers. They all have similar kind of brain damage. And how you end up with a psychopath and a killer depends on exactly when the damage occurs. It's really a very precisely timed thing. You get different kinds of psychopaths. These are successful psychopaths. And this particular PET scan had no orbital cortex activity. It had no temporal lobe activity. This whole sort of limbic system was not functioning. And I said, oh my God, this was one of these killers. Look, it's the exact same pattern as a killer. But when I looked down at the code, it was not one of the killers, it was me.
You're a neuroscientist.
I'm a neuroscientist. And we had all the subjects, but we needed a couple of controls. So I volunteered, and there was one that was very pathological. And I told the technician, I said, you got these switched. And I peeled back the covering on it, because we do it blindly, and it was me. I mentioned to my wife, I said, I just did, scans for this Alzheimer's study, and my PET scan came back, and I looked just like the psychopaths I've been studying it. And she said something very odd to me at the time. She says, it doesn't surprise me.
Let's have a look at the scan. You've put together this picture of two scans. Now, that's your brain, that psychopath one. Is that right?
Yeah, that looks like all the fundamental pattern of all the psychopaths I've been studying. That happens to be my scan. In red are those areas of the brain that are highly active. And in the blue and green and black, it's where there's very low activity. But all up here, what is called the social part of the brain, if you look at it specifically, those areas that are turned off are ones having to do with integrating your intellectual world, okay, with your emotional world, but also how you deal with people. And also, you can't quite see it, is the area having to do with empathy. The area having to do with emotional empathy, which is the kind of empathy you want when you're in a family or when you love somebody. It's that connectedness, and you're feeling what other people are feeling.
You haven't got that.
And that's like zero.
Simon Baron-Cohen in Cambridge. Welcome. Now, you've studied psychopaths. Does Jim's description of himself as a pro-social psychopath stack up?
I have to say I've got some skepticism, some questions, I guess. I guess one of the questions is about the reliability of the brain scans. You as a scientist know that we wouldn't just trust one piece of data.
Right.
When you saw this brain scan where basically a lot of frontal lobe activity seems to be missing or absent compared to a control, did you try to replicate it, to repeat it?
2005, you got the results. So 9 years later, and you still haven't done a second scan. Why not?
So
I don't, well, part of this is what I did was I then went through a number of analyses by psychoanalysts and by psychiatrists on psychopathy and took a number of the tests, PPI, which is a psychopathy index, and also the hair test and the Levinson test, some others, and they all came out with about the same answer. They would say I'm a borderline psychopath. So it was really that analysis, psychiatric analysis, that was the thing. So that's a possibility.
Okay, but Simon, is the point that you're making, are you therefore sceptical of this whole story? I mean, what is the point that you're making?
I think probably you and I would agree that psychiatry is not in great shape.
Right.
You get a lot of disagreement between psychiatrists as to what is the right diagnosis. And psychiatry can be a lot about opinion rather than sort of factual,
completely,
objective sort of consensus.
Eva, you work with kids who show disturbing traits. Now, I wonder what you think of Jim's story as you hear it.
Well, I wanted to follow up on how we would diagnose psychopathy. Is we would use the most commonly used tool is called the psychopathy checklist. It's a checklist of 20 different items, and they cover a broad spectrum of different sorts of characteristics, the four primary areas. So the first being, is there a deficient affective experience? So is the person kind of emotionally detached from other people? Are they lacking empathy? Are they callous? The second domain would be in their interpersonal style. So are they manipulative or arrogant or deceitful? The third area would be in reckless impulsivity or irresponsibility. And then the fourth domain, which is a bit more of a controversial domain in the field, is antisocial and criminal types of behavior.
And how high do you have to rate on this scale?
The way that we use the tool in the field is that we focus on a score of 30 out of 40.
Okay, you did this test, Jim?
Yeah, I've done 4 different of those, and I score.
What did you get out of 40?
I'm a 20. And I was a 24 once when I was tested.
So 20 out of 40 though, how would you regard that, Eva?
It wouldn't be considered in the psychopathic range.
And actually, we only have to open any newspaper or turn on the news any day of the week to hear examples of human cruelty. But it raises the same question about how we understand human cruelty. Well, the old theory to explain human cruelty is to talk about evil, that people do awful things to each other because they are evil. As a scientist, I find this not very useful as a term. I don't think it helps us understand what's going on. It's not just not explanatory, but it's dangerously circular. The alternative that I'm proposing is that we should explain human cruelty in terms of the erosion of empathy. So, what is empathy? Well, there are lots of definitions of empathy. My definition recognizes 2 components. The first is the cognitive part. That's the recognition or the understanding part. And I've defined that as the drive to identify what another person might be thinking or feeling. So it's all about putting yourself into someone else's shoes, to take their perspective and to imagine what's going on in their mind. The second component is what psychologists call affective, which is another word for emotional. It's the emotional reaction to somebody else's thoughts and feelings. And you can see my definition there as the drive to respond with an appropriate emotion to someone else's thoughts and feelings. The psychopath might be able to do the first part. They might be able to recognize that their victim is in pain, but not have the appropriate emotional response of wanting to alleviate another person's distress. So arguably, the psychopath does not have empathy. Empathy being on a spectrum. Here's the familiar bell curve that we see time and time again in nature when we look at individual differences that differs in the population. Most of us are going to be somewhere in the middle, but you can see that there'll be a minority of people who have very high empathy, and again, a minority who have very low empathy. The philosopher Martin Buber was also very interested in this question, and he identified that the point at which you start treating a person as an object is when you become capable of cruelty. And he distinguished 2 different ways that you can relate to a person. You can either relate to them as a person, what he called I-you relationship, or you can treat a person as an object, no different to this piece of furniture, what he calls I-it relationships. And the moment that you shift from one mode to the other is the point when your empathy has been switched off. I work in a department of psychiatry in the university, and so one perspective into how people can end up with low empathy is to look at specific psychiatric conditions. We've already mentioned psychopaths, but I'm going to be showing you 3 different personality disorders which can, I think, involve low empathy. And I call these zero negative because people can end up with literally 0 degrees of empathy. So these are the 3 personality disorders. The top one is borderline personality disorder. People with this condition have very unstable relationships and extreme mood swings. They tend to switch from one moment expressing affection to, within seconds, expressing anger. And they can lash out on people that are close to them, either physically or emotionally close to them. They often also threaten suicide with no intention of carrying it out, but also with no real consideration of the impact that such a threat has on the other person. The second personality disorder is psychopathic personality disorder. It's also sometimes known as antisocial personality disorder. And these are individuals, I think, also have low empathy, but in a different way. So they're diagnosed on the basis of being superficially very charming. They lull you into trusting them, but it soon turns out that almost everything they say is a lie. They'll use deception to get what they want. The last one, less well known, narcissistic personality disorder. You can see an image here of the Greek mythological figure Narcissus, who was only in love with himself and his own reflection. It really just describes individuals who are self-preoccupied, who don't really think about others all around them. John Bowlby, who worked at the Tavistock Clinic up in Swiss Cottage here in London, so he argued that attachment is key in the formation of empathy. So he argued that insecure attachment in childhood, either through neglect or even worse, through abuse, could lead to this outcome of delinquency. But that can't be the whole story. Avshalom Caspi, who looked at a particular gene, and what you can see is that the worst combination is in individuals who've experienced severe childhood maltreatment, but also carry this particular version of the gene. The earliest sort of case study from neurology that gave us the big clue as to where empathy resides was from this man called Phineas Gage, who was working on the railroad track in the 1840s in the States. And his job was to use a metal pole to push the dynamite down before they laid the railway track. And one day the dynamite went off a bit too early and blew that pole right up underneath his eye and through his brain. A horrific accident, but the reason it made medical history in neurology was that he didn't die. Indeed, he lived for another 12 years. They removed the pole. But what was striking was that his intelligence, his reasoning, didn't seem to be affected by this brain damage, nor was his memory or his language. Indeed, much of his psychological functioning was as it was before, except that his empathy seemed to be affected, that prior to the accident, he was described as a very courteous, polite individual. After the accident, he was described as very impulsive, very rude, unable to judge what was socially appropriate. More than 100 years later, the neuroscientist Hannah Damasio was able to obtain Phineas Gage's brain, which had been preserved in a vat, and put it into a modern MRI scanner to see exactly where the location of the damage was. And she inferred that it was in this left ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So if anyone asks you, where is empathy in the brain? It's in the left ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Well, that seems to be well confirmed by modern neuroscience. But what you can see here is that actually that's not the only region involved in empathy. By my count, there are at least 10 different parts of the brain. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is up there. It's been well confirmed by other studies, but so are many others, other regions, and that they're all highly connected so that we can talk about an empathy circuit, that when we empathize with another person, this network of regions are activated. And when individuals who have personality disorders or very low empathy have brain scans, we can also see that different parts of this network, this empathy circuit in the brain, are underactive or haven't developed in the usual way. There's at least one condition in psychiatry where individuals struggle with empathy, but it doesn't necessarily lead to acts of cruelty, and that is people on the autistic spectrum. So here we can see people with autism and the related condition of Asperger's syndrome. They have difficulties in social relationships and communication, and they too struggle to empathize. Their low empathy tends to lead them to avoid other people because they find people confusing, to withdraw from the social world rather than to commit acts of cruelty. So this is telling us that low empathy may be part of what happens when someone commits a cruel act, but it's not a symmetric relationship, that if you have low empathy, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to commit a cruel act.
Lars, you're a forensic and clinical psychologist. You assess violent criminals. What is a psychopath, in your view, the people that you see?
Well, firstly, I go by their interpersonal style with me. So some folks can be very, very charming, engaging, glib, superficial, can tell a very plausible story. Then I would look at their history, and usually folks are very highly psychopathic, have completely disorganised histories. They've had lots of impulsive, reckless, and dangerous behaviour, it's a bit of a mess, really. And then you will spend time talking to them about how they feel about it, how they feel about the things that they've done to other people and their life and that kind of thing.
So what are the key things, do you think? Like, what are the aha moments for you when you talk to those people and you think this person actually does, to my mind, fit that category of being a psychopath?
Well, it definitely be the cold-heartedness, the callousness, the lack of empathy is something that's very important. And the history, the disorganised history, the lots of irresponsible behaviour, the chaoticness usually, the inability to follow through with commitments and responsibilities, the letting people down, exploiting people, manipulating people.
Well, my response to finding out from people close to me, and you're just not connected. And my wife said the same thing. You're just not there. It's not
How long have you been married?
Well, we started dating when we were 12 now, so we've been dating 54 years. So,
So she's saying after 54 years you're not connected.
Well, she says, but I'm fun to be with, and I hang around fun people, and it's interesting. But in terms of emotional connection, she's just not there. For example, when your aunt dies, you're supposed to go to the funeral. You're not supposed to go with your buddies to a bar. And I would make up a story and do that stuff. I try to use my own traits, my own narcissism, my own ego to say, I can beat this. And I said, you know, it's not, this is not sincere. I'm just doing this as a game. It's not sincere that I really want to do it or care about it, but I am sincere about trying to change my behavior.
So it's like a game? So
it's an absolute game.
And a lot of my clients talk about their capacity to notice vulnerability in people and to hone in on it. I guess I was going to ask you, Jim, whether you feel that you're good at that.
Yeah. Well,
okay, so do you hone in on vulnerable people? Or vulnerability?
The immediate thing I look for is what are their weaknesses. Now, maybe some of you saw me looking around. Yeah, of course.
And what did you decide?
You don't have many.
Yeah, the charm is part of the profile, right? Yeah. Simon, what do you want to know?
So I'm very impressed by Jim's quite high levels of justice. He's got a kind of a morality. So to me, that doesn't quite fit with the psychopathic kind of self-diagnosis. Nothing that I've heard would rule out Asperger syndrome. And, you know, it's not a diagnostic. None of these things are diagnostic.
Simon, one of the key features of psychopaths is a lack of empathy, and that has been mentioned a little bit here. Can you briefly describe the different types of empathy to us and what happens when people lack it?
Sure. I mean, for the sake of keeping things short and brief, I would just divide empathy into two components. So one is cognitive empathy, which is the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes, to imagine what they're thinking and feeling. And typically psychopaths have good cognitive empathy. The other side of it is affective empathy or emotional empathy, which is it's not just recognizing someone else's thoughts and feelings, but having an appropriate emotion yourself in response to someone's thoughts and feelings. And typically a psychopath has reduced affective or emotional empathy. I mentioned Asperger's syndrome a moment ago because they kind of have the opposite profile to psychopaths because they struggle with cognitive empathy. They get quite confused by social situations and taking other people's points of view. But if they hear that somebody else is upset or if they hear that somebody else is suffering, it upsets them. And actually, you know, just like Jim wanted to go and have revenge on the bully, someone with Asperger's syndrome would also get equally incensed because they can see that somebody else is getting hurt.
Now, Linda, I know you've come along because you're interested in this. You've got Asperger's, yes? And does that description fit you, the description that Simon just gave?
I have a lot of emotional empathy.
But you struggle with cognitive empathy. So what does that mean for you in your life? Give us an example of where you have difficulty.
I'm not very good at a bar. I struggle with trying to understand what people are thinking, or the innate social graces, I guess, that most people sort of learn as a child or are born with. I just don't have them.
Okay, and but you have very high affective empathy. How does that show itself?
If somebody's going through a hard time, I go through that with them, like I'm in that time with them as well, like it's my experience as well.
What do you like watching the news?
Not very good. I don't watch it very often.
Why?
I cry a lot.
Okay. So are you interested in Jim's story? I mean, what are you interested in about him?
How we seem to be complete opposites from what I've read so far. So I seem to have an awesome amount of one type of empathy and next to none of the other, and Jim seems to be the opposite of that.
If somebody tells me a very upsetting story, or where they see awful things, I just don't have an emotional response. I don't cry. I don't feel it. My heart doesn't flutter. I don't feel any of that. But I still am interested to try to help them if I can. You know.
For me, it hurts me. Like I literally hurt when somebody else hurts.
I think it's the right thing to do, and I know. But for me, the good is the beauty of that.
This is where it doesn't fit into being a psychopath. You know, I think you do have a very strong sense of morality, which, thank goodness, right? But you like to help people. You like to fix people's problems.
What is empathy? How does it relate to Asperger's syndrome? I refer to it myself as an Aspergian. So there are actually two types of empathy. The first of which is called cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is basically you're able to look into someone else's mind and understand why they're thinking the way that they do. And then there's affective empathy, which is that moment where you're sitting in a room and you just feel like there's this tension, but you can't quite explain how you know. And that's really what affective empathy is. If it was the other way around, technically that would make me a psychopath or a narcissist. So I'll take the loss of cognitive empathy. There's this original research done by a guy in England named Simon Baron-Cohen, and he wrote early on in the paper that some of the findings were that autistic people and Aspergians didn't have empathy. But he also prefaced it, but we couldn't separate cognitive and affective empathy. The problem was the psychological community saw the study, and when they revised the DSM-5 and the ICD-11, those are the current versions of the diagnostic criteria, they wrote, autism and Asperger's lack in empathy, and they never specified which kind it was. And then there was this new research that was done that said, well, they do have empathy, it's affective empathy, they're missing cognitive empathy. They can't understand why people feel the way they do. How it creates this frustration, because you are thinking, because I mean, you feel what other people feel, and then you can't quite understand why.